Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: oil rises more than $1 on fears of spread of Middle East conflict. German prosecutors receive evidence of Russian war crimes. Gaza, the history of an embattled territory. Huawei suppliers top Asia stock benchmark to defy bad October. Ukraine latest, US says Russia is executing soldiers not following orders. Oil rises more than $1 on fears of spread of Middle East conflict. The Globe and Mail. Oil prices rose on Friday following reports that the U.S. military had struck Iranian targets in Syria. The strikes were in response to recent attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, which have increased since the start of the Israel-Hamas conflict. While the strikes did not directly impact supply, there are concerns that the conflict may spread and disrupt supply from major crude producer Iran, which backs Hamas. There are also fears that a wider war could impact shipments from Saudi Arabia and other large producers in the Gulf. Both Brent and WTI are on track to post their first weekly drop in 3 weeks as the geopolitical premium built on these fears has ebbed. German prosecutors receive evidence of Russian war crimes. Yahoo! The Clooney Foundation for Justice, CFJ, has submitted evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine to German prosecutors. The CFJ, which is dedicated to protecting human rights and gathering evidence of abuses, filed 3 cases on the behalf of 16 survivors and victims' families. The dossiers accuse 3 Russian commanders of war crimes including indiscriminate missile attacks on a resort, executions, acts of torture and sexual violence. The cases were filed under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which obliges countries to prosecute perpetrators of crimes that extend beyond their borders. The evidence has also been shared with the International Criminal Court. Gaza, the history of an embattled territory. Financial Times. The history of Gaza is one of conflict and conquest that stretches back millennia. The 363 square kilometers strip of land has changed hands between empires over many centuries, before becoming one of 2 Palestinian territories under Israeli occupation in the modern era. Outsiders have fought for supremacy in Gaza since ancient times. Many coveted its strategic position and status as a trading hub on the coastal route linking Egypt to the wider Middle East. Historical combatants have included the Pharaohs, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Fatimids, Mamluks, and Crusaders, according to French professor Jean-Pierre Fillia's book Gaza, A History. The Turkish Ottoman Empire held Gaza for several hundred years until defeated by the British in 1917. By the Second World War, Gaza was part of the League of Nations' mandate for British rule of Palestine. A post-war UN-backed plan to make Gaza City and its hinterland an Arab part of a partitioned Palestine soon collapsed. After war broke out between the newly created State of Israel and its Arab neighbors in 1948, Egypt moved in to occupy Gaza. Huawei suppliers top Asia stock benchmark to defy bad October. Bloomberg. Shares linked to Huawei have outperformed in Asia, with suppliers and partners of the Chinese tech giant making up a majority of the top gainers on the MSCI Asia Pacific Index this month. Huawei's electric vehicle partner Series Group is leading the gains with an advance of more than 48%, while software supplier iSoftStone Information Technology Group is up 29%. These trades reflect optimism towards China's mobile phone and semiconductor technologies, which have become rare bright spots in an otherwise sluggish market. However, some analysts believe that investors may lose interest in these stocks if other hot topics emerge. Ukraine latest, US says Russia is executing soldiers not following orders. Nikkei Asia. The US has information that the Russian military is executing soldiers who refuse to follow orders and threatening to execute entire units if they retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire, according to White House spokesperson John Kirby. This comes as the US announces a $150 million security assistance package for Ukraine, including AIM-9M missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Meanwhile, a Hamas delegation has arrived in Moscow, meeting with Russian officials to discuss the release of foreign hostages and the evacuation of Russian and other foreign citizens from the Gaza Strip. The war between Israel and Hamas has divided the United Nations Security Council, with Russia and China vetoing a US-backed draft resolution calling for a humanitarian corridor in Gaza. The US and UK opposed a Russian-backed text urging a broader ceasefire. In Cyprus, Canadian soldiers await potential orders for evacuation of citizens in Lebanon. The Globe and Mail. Canada has deployed more than 300 soldiers to Cyprus in preparation for the possibility of evacuating over 150,000 Canadians from Lebanon. The move comes amid a growing fear that a skirmish between Israel and Hamas in Gaza will escalate into a full-blown war, potentially necessitating the evacuation of Canadian citizens. The soldiers are currently stationed in a hotel in Cyprus, monitoring satellite imagery of Beirut airport and port, the likely staging grounds for an evacuation. The Canadian government has ordered the soldiers to be ready to respond to an evacuation at short notice, and to be stationed near Cyprus, Athens, and Beirut. The Canadian government has stated that it could evacuate citizens within 6 hours, but this would depend on decisions made in each country's capital. A total of 20 countries have sent staff to Cyprus to prepare for the evacuation of their citizens, and each country has representation at the Xenon Coordination Center, a Cypriot facility that allows countries to coordinate their evacuations. EU calls for humanitarian pauses for Gaza aid as Israel raids enclave. Reuters. European Union leaders have urged for pauses in Israeli bombing and Hamas rocket attacks in order to allow humanitarian aid to be delivered to Gaza. This comes as Israel prepares for a ground incursion into the area and as Palestinian militants clash with Israeli troops near the border. The 27 EU leaders have reached a compromise declaration expressing their gravest concern for the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and calling for continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Officers are flooding into Maine during the desperate manhunt for armed and dangerous Lewiston suspect. Yahoo! The manhunt is underway for Robert Card, a U.S. Army reservist, suspected of being the gunman behind a mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine. The shooting left 18 dead and 13 injured. Hundreds of investigators and officers are searching for Card, who is considered to be armed and dangerous. A note was discovered at the suspect's home during a search warrant being executed there. Investigators are now trying to determine the meaning of the note and how it could potentially guide their investigation. Card is a petroleum supply specialist in the Army Reserve. He had recently reported mental health issues, including hearing voices and threats to shoot up the National Guard base in Saco, Maine. Card was armed with an AR-15 style rifle when he killed 6 men and 1 woman at the Just-in-Time bowling alley. He then murdered 8 men at the Skiminji's Bar and Grill. Both locations are in Lewiston. Joe Biden warns Iran against targeting U.S. troops in the Middle East. South China Morning Post. U.S. President Joe Biden has sent a rare message to Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warning Tehran against targeting U.S. personnel in the Middle East, the White House said on Thursday after a spate of attacks on American forces in the region. Iran's mission to the United Nations did not immediately respond to a request for comment. U.S. officials want to avoid a wider conflict in the Middle East following the October 7 attack by the militant Hamas group on Israel that killed at least 1,400 people, mostly civilians. Unsafe, unprofessional, Chinese jet came within meters of U.S. B-52, says Pentagon. The Sydney Morning Herald. The U.S. military has accused a Chinese jet of flying dangerously close to a U.S. bomber over the South China Sea earlier this week. The Chinese J-11 jet allegedly came within 3 meters of the B-52 aircraft and flew in an unsafe and unprofessional manner. The incident is part of a pattern of what the U.S. has called increasingly risky behavior by Chinese military aircraft. The Pentagon has previously stated that Chinese military aircraft have carried out maneuvers close to U.S. aircraft nearly 200 times since 2021. The incident comes amid tense relations between China and the U.S. over a range of issues. Hello, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world. Let's dive into today's news. First, oil prices rose over $1 due to fears of the Middle East conflict spreading. The U.S. military struck Iranian targets in Syria in response to attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. While the strikes didn't directly impact oil supply, there are concerns that the conflict could disrupt supply from major crude producer Iran. There are also fears that a wider war could impact shipments from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf producers. Next, the Clooney Foundation for Justice has submitted evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine to German prosecutors. The cases accuse 3 Russian commanders of war crimes including missile attacks, executions, torture, and sexual violence. This evidence has also been shared with the International Criminal Court. Moving on, let's talk about the history of Gaza. This embattled territory has changed hands between empires for centuries and has been fought over by various powers. From the Pharaohs to the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and more, Gaza has been a strategic location and trading hub. It was under Egyptian occupation before becoming one of 2 Palestinian territories under Israeli occupation. Now, on to Huawei. Shares linked to Huawei have outperformed in Asia, reflecting optimism towards China's mobile phone and semiconductor technologies. Huawei's partners and suppliers have seen significant gains this month. However, some analysts believe that investor interest may wane if other hot topics emerge. In Ukraine, the US says that the Russian military is executing soldiers who refuse to follow orders and threatening to execute entire units if they retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. The US has announced a $150 million security assistance package for Ukraine. On the other side of the conflict, a Hamas delegation has arrived in Moscow to discuss the release of foreign hostages and the evacuation of citizens from the Gaza Strip. In Cyprus, Canadian soldiers are awaiting potential orders for the evacuation of Canadian citizens in Lebanon. With the escalating conflict between Israel and Hamas, there is growing concern that Canadians may need to be evacuated. Soldiers are monitoring satellite imagery of Beirut airport and port, the likely staging grounds for an evacuation. European Union leaders have called for pauses in Israeli bombing and Hamas rocket attacks to allow humanitarian aid to reach Gaza. Israel is preparing for a ground incursion as tensions escalate. The EU leaders express their grave concern for the humanitarian situation and call for continued, rapid, safe, and unhindered access for aid. In the US, a manhunt is underway for a US Army reservist suspected of a mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine. The shooting left 18 dead and 13 injured. Investigators are searching for the suspect, who is considered armed and dangerous. U.S. President Joe Biden has sent a rare message to the Iranian Supreme Leader warning against targeting U.S. personnel in the Middle East. The U.S. wants to avoid a wider conflict in the region. Finally, the U.S. military has accused a Chinese jet of flying dangerously close to a U.S. bomber over the South China Sea. This incident is part of a pattern of increasingly risky behavior by Chinese military aircraft. That's all for today's news. Remember, the world is full of twists and turns, and it's our job to navigate them with a sense of humor and an open mind. Now, over to you, my dear viewers. What are your thoughts on these news stories? I'm all ears. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.